welcome to this webinar organized by PRIO and Security Dialogue. Today, we are very happy to discuss a new special issue that was recently published by our journal. The special issue with the title Making Security Public was guest edited by Claudia Aradão and Georgios Gluftsios. And this was the first issue of Security Dialogue published in 2026. 2026 is a year where Security Dialogue started to be published by Oxford University Press after many years of fruitful collaboration with SAGE. And it's also a year where a new editorial team comes into the work. The new editorial team is composed by Christopher Liden and Maria Gabriel Sanjumbert as deputy editors, and myself, Bruno Oliveira Martins, as editor-in-chief. And then we continue with a team of associate editors that continues from the previous team: Philip Fraud, Tony Hostrup, Marcia Henry, Kate Miller, Michael Murphy, João Nunes, and Nisha Shah, that is here with us today. So this special issue that we'll be discussing today was edited during Mark Salter's long tenure as editor-in-chief of Security Dialogue. And we obviously want to thank him very much for his contribution to the journal. All the work that has been put into making Security Dialogue the journal that we cherish so much these days. And also for shepherding the work of this special issue together with Nisha Shah. At a practical level, as you can see, we have a long list of speakers today. And it was important for us to give platform to the guest editors and to some of the authors so that we have ample time for discussion. We also brought in 3 associate editors to discuss the contribution, the articles, the volume, etc. And so, together with the fact that we had so much interest from external participants to attend, we had to make the decision of broadcasting this on YouTube. But unfortunately, we don't have the possibility of have a dynamic Q&A from the audience because, with dozens and dozens and dozens of participants and plenty of speakers, this would be very difficult to manage. So the event will be live streamed and recorded, and it will be made available afterwards. So the structure for today is that we will have a set of presentations, first by the guest editors of the special issue, and then by 2 of the authors that contribute to the special issue. Unfortunately, William Walters woke up sick this morning, and he will not be able to be with us today. So unfortunately, we will not be presenting and discussing his paper. On the other hand, we will have a little bit more time to have the presentations from the remaining colleagues. So the volume itself proposes to explore how contestations of security emerge, unfold, fizzle out or fail, and the consequences that these have. And so this is a proposed framework to understand and that is built on 3 main forms: scandals, controversies, and struggles. So these are forms by which security contestations emerge. Obviously, these forms are not exclusive, and the guest editors will have the opportunity to explain this further. And certainly there are other forms of contestation that include complaints, debates, disputes, disagreements, among others. But how these contestations are analyzed is also a methodological question, and that the different articles in the special issue explore. And the articles, they go beyond merely documenting security practices to unpack how actors such as journalists, lawyers, civil society organizations, or artists encounter secrecy and opacity in their efforts to make security public. And moreover, and importantly, scandals, controversies, and struggles problematize and destabilize presumed facts of security, which is very much in line with critical security studies tradition of not understanding security as something objective. So I will give the floor now to Claudia and Georgios to make their presentation, and I look forward to hearing from them.
Thank you very much, Bruno, for this introduction to the special issue. We are both, Georgios and I, are delighted to have the opportunity to celebrate, but also discuss more around the special issue and its theme. And I'd like to thank you and the Security Dialogue new editorial team and PRIO as well for organizing this discussion and the webinar. So this will be a brief introduction to the introductory article. You can see it in the next slide. So you can search it if you would want to follow along. That Georgios Glouftios and I co-authored for the special issue. And to build up on what Bruno was just saying, we start with this question about why scandals, controversy, and struggles. Why do we kind of place them, or do we place the focus on them? And indeed, the concept of contestation has been central to critical engagement with security practices. If we think, for example, even to the kind of well-rehearsed definition of security as an essentially contested concept. But how exactly do contestations vary, right? What meanings do they take? How do these practices transform? There are many vocabularies that are used often interchangeably with contestations, so scandals, controversies, being some of them, but also polemic, disputes, affairs, disagreements, and so on. So we argue that these vocabularies are important because they draw attention to the multiplicity and heterogeneity of processes of contesting security practices. And you can see this on the next slide. So scandals, controversies, and struggles are not ideal types in the approach proposed here, but are forms, they are political forms, and they're also processes, and therefore they can entwine, they can transform, they can shape one another. Again, they are not exhaustive, but they are kind of analytical inroads we propose, and the contributors to these special issues take up and advance for an agenda in critical security studies. So I will start by outlining these differences in order to build and contribute to more precise analytical vocabularies as contestation. So I'll start then in the next slide with scandals. And I'll actually try to offer 3 examples as ways in. So many of you are likely familiar with the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, better known as Frontex. And what you can see in the picture on the right-hand side is the result of an investigation concerning Frontex's complicity in pushbacks in Greece. And this was the result of a long investigation by journalists involving Lighthouse reports. And you can see here a particular emergence or a process of scandalization at work, right? It kind of exposes certain transgressions. So scandals have been received perhaps less attention in critical security studies so far, but they have been the object of research across disciplines. And kind of the analytical specificity, in a sense, is that they unfold through these kinds of denunciations or accusations of a transgression, followed by justifications, the collection of proofs, and the public presentation of evidence. Scandals, however, require a public to emerge, right? And we use the language of convening a public, hence the making security public, however small this public could be. The second illustration comes also from engagements with Frontex. This is to introduce the concept of security controversies. So again, on the right-hand side, you can see it. Probably you can't. Not sure you can read it, but this is a screenshot from a decision by the European Ombudsman at the end of 2023 in a response to a complaint submitted by a coalition of NGOs, including Privacy International, among others, again against Frontex for not conducting human rights assessments in providing technology assistance to non-EU countries, therefore risking the transfer of surveillance technology to authoritarian regimes. So what you can see here that in particular regulatory arrangements, particular questions around human rights, that become the object of controversy, right? Particular questions around how assistance should be provided and assessed. So we propose, again, building on interdisciplinary literature, that controversies refer to situations in which knowledge claims, technologies, policy and regulatory frameworks and practices themselves become subject to public interrogation and dispute. Though, again, how the public can differ. As science and technology studies scholar Adele Clark has pointed out, controversies often involve more than two parties. So again, there's this kind of element of heterogeneity. In critical security studies, interestingly, scholars have used the term controversies, and they've attended to controversies, particularly as also involving socio-material processes. Right? And again, controversies themselves require forms of visibility and publicity. However, you can see already that there are differences from scandals. And finally, to close, the third concept that we introduce, and in the next slide, thank you, Georgios, is that of security struggles. And again, this, and here I realize this is quite dark, the image. In 2020, a coalition of NGOs and grassroots organizations started the hashtag Abolish Frontex. It was a campaign, but it's kind of better known as the hashtag. And as they described the aims of hashtag Abolish Frontex, it is working towards ending the EU border regime, dismantling the border industrial complex, and building a society where people are free to move and live. So struggles, we argue, name a different political form, right, that the contestations of security and making security public can take. According to Lara Montesinos-Coleman and Dorte Rosenau, we cite, you can see here, struggles point to a conflict-oriented understanding of politics and the need to engage, I quote, situated practices of social and or political mobilization against injurious logics of oppression, exclusion, and exploitations. So it's not about problematizing a transgression of values, as with scandals or certain socio-technical uncertainty or regulatory regimes or controversies, but it is about aiming to undo, redo, or otherwise abolish, right, security regimes, security measures. It's kind of also highlighting not particular values, but the limits of kind of existing security practices. And on this note, I turn to Georgios, who will now discuss some of the analytical sensibilities that this approach is actually shared.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. So once we explain what we mean by scandals, controversies, and struggles in the paper, we introduce a set of analytical sensibilities in order to, let's say, more systematically study these forms of contestation. So the first sensibility is related to a focus on matters of concern and matters of care, and this refers mainly to issues around which scandals, controversies, and struggles emerge, as well as to the ways that different actors come to relate to those issues. So the papers that we collected in this special issue engage with issues like police violence and human rights abuses, the uncertain origin of deadly pathogens and health emergencies, the covering up of finance-related legalisms and elite corruption, the opacity and illegitimacy of surveillance and counter-terrorist programs, and the impact of security practices on the life chances of marginalized communities. Now, the second analytical sensibility that we propose is related to the socio-material scenes where scandals, controversies, and struggles unfold. So scenes may refer to specific places, such as a courtroom, a security expo, a laboratory, a parliamentary inquiry committee, where disputes about security emerge. But they can also expand spatiotemporally as scandals, controversies, and struggles evolve both offline and online. So what is important to analyze, or at least this is what we argue in the paper, is the socio-material composition of such scenes. So this is crucial to understand how subjects and objects that compose scenes come to interact to hide, expose, translate, and negotiate information about security. So subjects may assume multiple roles that we should analytically account for. Think, for example, investigative journalists who contribute to the exposure of scandals or document the activity of inquiry committees in order to translate technical and complex information about security programs to the wider public. Whistleblowers, academics, civil society organizations, and oversight bodies engage in collective struggles over making security's violence and injustice visible. They all shape, in one way or another, the composition of scenes within which scandals, controversies, and struggles unfold, and participate actively in processes of making security public. But besides subjects, we should also pay attention to objects, devices, and infrastructures. So think, for instance, about weapon systems, money, spyware, vaccines, and other material elements that may engender scandals, spark controversies, or lie at the core of struggles. Objects may also play an active role in making security public. So it's not just subjects, but also objects that matter in process of making public. For instance, satellite images, audio and video recordings, geolocation data, slides, entries in databases, debris, as well as the grotesque body counts that we have been accustomed to in our contemporary wartime realities, may act as material witnesses that to some extent embody knowledge about violence and injustices that result from security. And ultimately, ultimately, studying scandals, controversies, and struggles necessitates an understanding of how knowledge claims and evidence are staged. So we are interested in how they become credible and acquire weight in disputes and contestations relevant to security. Staging refers to all those practices through which various actors, policymakers, lawyers, scientists, journalists, advocacy groups, and so on, produce and communicate knowledge about security. So our invitation is essentially to study how, where, when, by whom, and under what material conditions such claims are staged. And as a concluding remark, and this is the final slide that we have, I want to say a few words about politics and critique. So building upon Jacques Rancière's understanding of politics, we view processes of making security public as resulting in redistributions of the sensible, so that which is visible, audible, sayable, knowable, and ultimately actionable about security. So such redistributions matter politically because they determine the share that different publics have in knowledge about security. So this knowledge shapes what questions can be asked, the kinds of critiques that various actors formulate, and the collective actions to counter, refute, or resist the violence and injustices of security. And the kind of critique that we are pointing forward here is twofold. First, as most of the special issue articles do, it involves tracing, unpacking, and analyzing the unfolding of scandals, controversies, and struggles in order to document, interpret, and potentially contribute to processes of making security public. Second, critique may also involve actively intervening in scandals, controversies, and struggles through proximity and collaboration with actors outside academia who expose and contest security practices. And the works of Ludeck Stavinoha and Charlotte Heath Kelly are very important in that regard. Now, focusing on scandals, controversies, and struggles, as both political forms and analytical lenses is a valuable exercise to render sensible contentious practices and security issues that span from themes like the war on terror to mundane or obscure practices and infrastructures of surveillance, policing, and border management. Scandals, controversies, and struggles lie at the heart of contentious politics of security, as they shape what different publics know about it. This knowledge can provoke reactions that challenge security's legitimacy, calling for democratic oversight, accountability, as well as resistance to security measures, practices, and infrastructures. And I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Georgios and Claudia. This was excellent. The article is excellent. The volume is excellent, and I think that this was a very good, introduction, setting the stage also for the debate that we want to have afterwards, where we can go, from this kind of more general framework article to more specific contributions that get into and that operationalize some of the ideas that you have just put forward. I will pass on now to Charlotte for her presentation. Please go ahead.
All right. Hi, everybody. I don't have any slides. As I was explaining to the editors, I'm completely tech phobic and risk averse. So it's just me talking, I'm afraid, for around 10 minutes. So my paper in the special issue, it's about almost a sort of paradoxical relationship between scandalization as a practice and the return of harmful practices in rehabilitated forms. And those two processes are being part of one process, being a double movement of scandalization. So the inspirations for this are Jamie Johnson's work, who wrote a really crucial piece on scandalization as line drawing. And so when you scandalize, in his case, one form of violence, what you're doing is actually enacting a line where other forms of violence are by comparison normalized and okay. So here you see the relationship between scandalization and sort of rehabilitation of other forms of violence in his terms. I've also used a lot of the work of Timothy Pasherat, really brilliant author, really brilliant book, recommend it to all of you. It's not politics per se, it's anthropology, it's ethnography. But Timothy Pasherat, he works on how harmful practices come back despite being scandalized. So very familiar terrain for what I'm going to talk about. And he looks at the mechanisms through which this happens of concealment, compliance, and compartmentalization. We're going to struggle a lot with words beginning with C in this presentation. I promise you, throughout, it's coming. So Pasherat's work is about regulatory responses that come through scandal and re-legitimate the same practices where very little has changed, but now they're okay through concealment, compliance, and compartmentalization. Right, so that's the background. I'm looking at scandalization over a 50-year period in one particular case as an iterative process of this happening. And the original scandal that I'm looking at in the paper is what has become called the political abuse of psychiatry, where the Soviet Union basically hospitalized democracy activists in the 70s and 80s. This practice wasn't just the Soviet Union, but a lot of it was undertaken in the Soviet Union. And the scandal was a very productive endeavor by psychiatric professional associations in the United States and in Britain to say that this practice is completely unacceptable and to hold this practice up to the the gaze of the world and of the profession, and to say that this is not acceptable. You cannot simply grab democracy activists off the street, interrogate them, and then throw them into psychiatric institutions and drug them, which is what was happening. Through the 70s and 80s, this scandalization worked, and the Soviet Union had to leave world professional organizations to avoid being thrown out. And the codification of psychiatric ethics comes at this point. It did not pre-exist the scandal. It was produced by the scandal. So we begin to get codes of practice that say you can't use psychiatric practice like this. And the codes state, importantly, through reference to the Soviet Union's political abuse, you can only use psychiatric tools for health benefits where there is evidence of psychiatric illness. So it limits it to the practice of medicine and not the practice of security. So, given the centrality of the British and the American professional associations of psychiatrists, you probably think that it would be unlikely that they would start doing this in the aftermath of this scandal. Well, in the case of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, they've maintained a really good set of archives and a really good set of positional statements about the war on terror and how psychiatry should never, be used in detention of potential terrorists, etc. But it is being used, and this is the story of how this practice has come back through the codes designed to stop it. So the method for this paper is FOI. So effectively, a bunch of activists from MedAct discovered the existence of something called the Vulnerability Support Hubs in 2016, have collected the data on it, forced the release on the data of what was going on. The Vulnerability Support Hubs is now called the CTCCS. I warned you, there'd be a lot of Cs. That stands for Counterterrorism Clinical Consultancy Service. And effectively what it does since 2016 is it is refining its process over the years. It is a buffer zone in between the NHS, the health service, and the security services, counterterrorism policing, where information moves both ways. And in this zone in the middle are 6 consultant forensic psychiatrists who are both security cleared to receive information from the security state, but also NHS employed clinicians, so they can receive NHS data. And in the middle, they decide what moves back out to counterterrorism policing and what moves the other way. So they are a clearinghouse and a translation house for information. And effectively, this is how counterterrorism can, without your consent, if they are interested in you, obtain your medical records specific to your mental health. So they're particularly interested, we see this in the FOIs, in schizophrenia, psychosis, and autism. This is what they really care about as things they want to risk manage in your presentation. And they use this to design tactical options to deal with you in the community. Quick note before we get to the 3 Cs. If these people were actually planning any kind of terrorist conspiracy or terrorist attack, they would not go through this program. They would be arrested and sent through the criminal justice system. This is a liaison and diversion service. This is for people who are not actively a threat. Although you can imagine the thinking is that they might become one day. So this is a very specialist, very elaborate system that's been set up, and it rehabilitates psychiatric participation in counterterrorism. So it's important that you know that outside of this system, the NHS shares data with the police every single day. It's very banal. There is a form for it. If it's extremely banal, police fill it in, hand it over, NHS fill in the gaps, send it back. If the information request is a bit more sensitive, it will go through a Caldecott Guardian process. That's also really quite banal. This process for mental health information and the counterterrorism police is so sensitive that it has this completely different elaborate architecture. And this is why I'm arguing that this scandal is being echoed in this process, because there are normal processes that you could use, but they won't. So to the 3 Cs, how does this thing work? What does it do? How is it rehabilitating harmful practices that were once scandalized? So compartmentalization is huge in rehabilitating the transfer of medical information to the counterterrorism policing and putting people sometimes in hospital or sometimes under surveillance through medical tools by the police. Adding in this compartment is very useful. So the hub or the pod is a compartment in between the NHS and counterterrorism policing. And this compartmentalization, borrowing from Pasherat, it introduces a buffer, and it can be presented as a minimization of information sharing. So information that's not specifically needed does not transfer across. The example given is addresses. Police will try and use this to get the address of a suspect. The buffer kicks in, the address is not shared. The compartment aids the positioning of this as legitimate information sharing. It does a lot of other stuff as well. The compartment is very useful for this program as an elaborate design, because when counterterrorism police send a request for information, the clinicians in the hub do the work. They phone the clinician or email the clinician in the NHS. This is your counsellor. This is your psychologist. With that request of information, the NHS is sharing within the NHS. This is highly important for data sharing practice. They are not sharing it with an external organisation. The information is shared within the NHS. So there's a lower bar for them to tell the person, yes, I'm satisfied with your request. This person has a diagnosis of autism. They are not compliant with the treatment regime we have in place for this, that, and the other. So that helps the information to move. And then here in the pod, do they decide what is relevant to pass to the police? So you don't see too much of the journey. It's compartmentalized. Similarly, the other way, to get this information to move, this clinician in the pod advises the police on how to frame their request for information. It advises them on what a consultant in the NHS needs to see, which is there is a threat to the public. And so the form of words that comes the other way is informed by this. So it's a very, very useful compartment, but it also makes things look a lot more legitimate because it stops some information from moving. I'm probably running out of time, so I'm going to get on to compliance. Compliance from Pasherat's typology is so important here. Effectively, what was once considered harmful abuse and was scandalized and actually created codes of conduct from psychiatrists, this is now treated as a matter of performative compliance with checklists. So we weren't able to scandalize this program. We hit a brick wall because when the journalists went to interview the CTCCS, they could hold up a data sharing agreement and the legality of what is happening here. So compliance does a huge amount of work. They have a data sharing agreement. It is the most ridiculous data sharing agreement I've ever FOI'd for and got. It names every single law you could possibly imagine as grounding its practice. It goes through legislation on data sharing. It goes through legislation on preventing crime. It goes through safeguarding the vulnerable. It goes through various different forms of law and appeals to all of them simultaneously as justifying what it's doing. It reframes the harms of covertly sharing people's medical information so that they can be profiled. It reframes them as compliance with GDPR, because there are exceptions to GDPR where your information can be shared if it's in the public interest. So it reframes it as a public interest. I'm looking at my notes. Yeah. Oh, and the most important thing I want to mention here is that this elaborate system is constructed in this way for a purpose, and that's to effectively justify the fact that the patient never knows and has never asked for consent. And the way that they do this, I've recently had to do a data protection impact assessment myself, and it reminds me of doing that. You don't have to ask for consent if you don't have the person's details, so long as you can justify it in the public interest. So they designed the system, it appears to me, so that the counterterrorism police don't have any contact with the patients. There is this buffer in the way. There is a compartment through which the NHS manages what it's going to share and what it isn't. And so when the information gets to counterterrorism policing, they wouldn't be able to ask for consent because they don't know anything about how to contact this person, which is a genuine answer which was given to me in an interview by the detective leading this program. It's designed to fit in this space where they can't ask for consent. It wouldn't be practical. And so they get away with the fact that no one has ever asked for consent. And this is all compliance with legislation. And they can present it in this way. Finally, concealment. All of this enacts concealment the entire way through. It's concealment top to bottom. The NHS practitioners who receive the email and the phone call about you and your treatment compliance and the request to share information about you, they don't know the full journey of where that information is going. All they're told is that a specialist NHS clinician who works for CTCCS is asking for it because there is something to do with radicalization about that patient. That's all they find out. They don't know that it's going to be used to potentially, it can be used to hospitalize you, but that is rare. It is more often used to design a covert form of liaison and diversion in your life. Finally, before I conclude, concealment operates throughout this, but in multiple ways, in that you don't even know that you've been harmed, so that you don't know if you don't even know that you should make a subject access request to find out if your information is shared, because you're never told, and so you don't know. As activists working on this and researchers going through the FOIs, we can't ask either, because information law also stops us asking who has been impacted by this, who should we be telling to put in a subject access request. So we have had to go through incredible loops to try and get round this hurdle, because all of the laws work against us and effectively for government agencies sharing information between them. So the conclusion, because I'm probably out of time by this point, is that scandalization, you can also think of it as an iterative process. In my case, it's over 50 years where the psychiatric collaboration with effectively national security and intelligence agencies has been scandalized. Rules have been put in place, and then those rules have been turned to rebuilding psychiatric collaboration with counterterrorism agents. So scandalization operates with this double movement in a relationship with regularization. It might not always, but in my case it does. And I think Pascherat's 3 Cs are incredibly useful for looking at the mechanisms of how these harmful practices come back in rehabilitated forms. And that is the end of my probably too long presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. No worries. I think this is really a great a great case of a really empirically rich paper that really operationalizes the framework that Claude and Georgios put forward in the introduction. Like really a case where in order to operate the critique, you actually engage with the subject, and as an example of how scandals in this case are really productive of effect. So this is really interesting. Thanks so much. Now I will pass on to Ludek, that also has a presentation. Please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Bruno. Let me just pull it up. Okay, hopefully you can see.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, thanks so much, Bruno, and thanks, Georgios and Claudia, for putting together this special issue and to be here to be able to present this paper. So for a brief moment, back in 2022, a little-known surveillance program run by Frontex became the focus of political scrutiny at the EU level, and then almost as quickly, it largely disappeared from view. And that moment of visibility did not happen by accident. It was the result, in part, of a media investigation that I was involved in alongside a group of journalists. And this paper grew out of that collaboration. Over several years, we've been investigating the EU's 2 principal agencies involved in the field of migration management, Frontex and Europol. and particularly the data sharing that takes place between these two agencies. And these investigations that were published across multiple media outlets have relied heavily on internal documents obtained through the EU's FOI mechanism, a mechanism that I've been using for several years to extract documents from these EU institutions. And this special issue offered a great opportunity for me to step back from some of that journalistic work and to critically reflect on how FOI is implicated in turning opaque security practices, especially as regards the EU's border regime, into objects of public political contestation. So at the center of this paper is the controversy around Frontex's so-called PEDRA program that stands for Processing Personal Data for Risk Analysis. And its planned and ultimately unlawful expansion that took place in 2022. Now, very briefly, without going into too much of the technical details of PEDRA itself, PEDRA can be considered a data harvesting program where Frontex border guards that are deployed at the EU's external borders extract information from newly arrived migrants about suspects of cross-border crime. So this is not information about the migrants themselves, it's rather what they tell these officers, Frontex officers, about so-called smugglers. And that data is then shared with Europol and used by Frontex for its so-called risk analysis activities. So PEDRA is very much a core component of the EU sort of border surveillance infrastructure, but it's received relatively little attention in scholarly literature. It was until 2022, it wasn't exactly a hidden program, but it was certainly opaque in the sense that very few people had an awareness of its existence, let alone of what it actually entailed. Now, in 2021, Frontex attempted to significantly expand this program. It adopted 2 management board decisions that laid the sort of rules, the legal framework for the expansion of PEDRA that would allow for gathering data not just about suspects, but also, for instance, victims of cross-border crime, in this case, mostly smuggling and trafficking. It expanded the range of data that could be collected by Frontex officers, including very sensitive personal data. And 6 months later, the EDPS, the European Data Protection Supervisor, came out with an opinion on this proposed expansion and basically struck it down and said it has to be suspended because it poses severe risks to fundamental rights and breaches a whole range of provisions under EU data protection legislation. Now, the EDPS decision coincided with the investigation that we published in Der Spiegel and Balkan Insight, where we showed how Frontex and European Commission officials had effectively sidelined data protection watchdogs and ignored repeated warnings about legal overreach. Following this, the European Parliament organized a hearing on PEDRA, and for a brief moment, PEDRA was made visible to wider publics and turned into an object of political contestation. And it's precisely this transformation of PEDRA from being an opaque program into an object of contestation and the role of FOI in that transformation that I was interested in exploring in this paper. I was interested in understanding how FOI can be mobilized, not just to interrogate the formation of these controversies and how they unfold, but how FOI can be mobilized to actually intervene in these controversies. What kinds of knowledge FOI can produce and how it is implicated in broader epistemic struggles around the EU's border regime. Okay. So in this paper, I engage with work that has problematized the idea that secrecy and transparency are simple binary opposites. There's a whole range of literature on that. I won't go through this here, but of course, Georgios and others have shown that transparency mechanisms like FOIA can become implicated in secrecy, or what I call regimes of opacity. For instance, FOI disclosures may obscure more than they reveal through selective disclosures, redactions, and so on. Secrecy then is not just about hiding, but it often takes the form of obfuscation that produces uncertainty and confusion. Secrecy, in brief, is a process that is continually enacted and contested by various social and political actors. So moving beyond the secrecy-transparency binary is key, I argue, for grasping the ambivalence of FOI in processes of public political contestation. And here I think Lisa Stempnitzky's distinction between exposure, that is the act of making information publicly available, and revelation is particularly useful, where revelation refers to the collective recognition that there has been a significant change in what is publicly known. So FOI disclosures, crucially, not all exposures become revelations, just as not all controversies become political scandals. FOI disclosures can remain idle unless they are picked up and transformed through the interpretative work of journalists, activists, policymakers, and others. Empirically, this paper draws on documents that I obtained through more than a dozen FOI requests between 21 and 24. And that, of course, included multiple appeals, complaints to the European Ombudsman, targeting multiple EU institutions that are involved in migration management. And after this kind of a long process, arduous process, that I'm sure resonates with research done by others, this resulted in a trove of documents covering the full lifespan of PEDRA, from its inception in 2015 through the 2022 controversy, as well as its quieter aftermath. So I was able to gather fragments of documents, different categories of documents, where I distinguish between first order and second order documents. So the first order documents are those that actually relate to PEDRA itself, minutes of meetings, emails, opinions issued by the data protection officer, audits conducted by the EDPS, etc. Now, second order documents are those generated as part of the FOI process itself. So that would be correspondence between me and Frontex, for instance, where I request documents, their official replies, the Ombudsman's recommendation for Frontex to provide wider disclosure, all of that kind of documentation. So in the paper, I approach FOI as both a methodological and an analytical vantage point. On the one hand, it's a tool for accessing the live archives of EU bureaucracies, but it's also a lens for scrutinizing how secrecy is actually enacted and contested. So in the analysis, I trace the evolution of the PEDRA controversy. I try to show how FOI allows researchers to probe aspects of controversies that have thus far received less attention. That is how these controversies actually germinate and unfold, not just on the public stage, but also in the bureaucratic backstage. So in the first part, I focus on what I call the pre-controversy phase. And here, FOI documents like the one you can see here reveal that significant internal contestation existed well before anything actually became public. In particular, Frontex's DPO repeatedly raised concerns about the legality of the expansion of the program. As you can see here, the DPO states in this opinion that they issued close to 100 recommendations, half of which were not taken on board. It warns Frontex that its interests cannot be achieved by breaching compliance with EU legislation. There's a warning about serious risk of function creep, violations of data protection law, and the imperative to consult the EDPS. And similar warnings were issued across a whole range of documents issued by the DPO. Now, these warnings were dismissed by senior officials in both Frontex and the European Commission, who were keen to move forward with the project. And this is just one example that shows how FOI can make visible contestations that otherwise remain hidden in the bureaucratic backstage, and that subsequently were placed at the center of the controversy when it became public. And that's the second part of the analysis, where I focus on the height of the controversy when Frontex was ordered by EDPS to suspend PEDRA or its expansion, and where it gathered the attention of the European Parliament, of some segments of civil society, at least for a brief moment. And there was a hearing at the European Parliament where, for the first time, Frontex and European Commission and Europol officials were questioned about PEDRA. Now, what I do in the paper is try to identify several strategies through which EU institutions effectively try to decontroversify PEDRA, to contain it and to limit the kind of political fallout. So, for instance, during this European Parliament hearing, EU officials successfully avoided discussing the program's unlawfulness instead emphasizing its robust legal framework. Yet internal documents like the one you can see here suggest that they were fully aware of the unlawful nature of Pedra's proposed expansion. And it's through these strategies of obfuscation, I argue, that explain why the controversy was relatively short-lived and did not escalate into a full political scandal. Now, it's worth noting here that the Pedra controversy took place in the immediate aftermath of the Frontex pushback scandal that Claudia referenced at the beginning. Yet it didn't quite transform, it was contained, it didn't feed that scandal in any meaningful sense. And finally, in the paper, I consider the aftermath. And here I reflect on the limits of FOI. And I draw on this idea of FOIs as partial witnesses. And I argue that FOI can never fully penetrate the irreducible opacity of complex security infrastructures like Pedra. Many documents were withheld or redacted, and even Commission officials tasked with overseeing Frontex seemed puzzled, according to the documents, as to what had actually happened following the temporary suspension of Pedra. They did not have the full, clear picture of what took place. So FOI does not open the black box magically. The archive is partial and fragmented. And what is certainly the case is that the mere act of disclosure via FOI does not produce political change in the absence of the mobilization of other social political actors. And in the case of Frontex and Europol, the Pedra controversies certainly did not put an end to their data craving fantasies, which have continued ever since. But that does not diminish the subversive potential of FOI. That is, the potential to subvert official claims, to reveal norm violations and transgressions, and to make at least some security practices visible and therefore politically contestable. I'll leave it at this. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Another really interesting, rich, empirically rich paper. Really interesting also kind of to try to reflect a little bit the situations in which a controversy becomes a scandal versus the situation where it does not, in a sense, escalate into that, and then the implications that it has in terms of producing effects. So really, really, really fascinating. So what we have prepared now is that we have 3 discussants of the papers and the special issue that will offer some comments on the papers and also ask questions that will then go back to the colleagues that have presented so far. So we have 3 people that are associate editors of Security Dialogue, Nisha, Christopher, and Maria. Nisha is also the associate editor that is responsible for special issues, and therefore she was also the one that has been more closely involved with this project. So I think it's very adequate that we start with you, Nisha. Please go ahead.
Sure. Well, I want to just thank everyone for attending, even if we can't necessarily see you. And I also want to specifically thank and congratulate Claudia and Georgios on this wonderful special issue. And as Bruno stated, as the special issue editor at Security Dialogue, I've been particularly closely involved with this special issue. It was also my first project after assuming the role of special issues editor. So I also feel a kind of personal connection to this project. I just wanted to put a little plug out for special issue proposals for Security Dialogue. And, I'm happy to discuss any ideas that you have, really just even if they're preliminary ideas, and discuss the process of submitting special issue proposals and also just the overall review and production process. So please get in touch via email, and I'd be happy to discuss more. Now, in terms of this special issue, I just have maybe a couple of general remarks. I had some more specific questions for William, but I'm going to try to translate those into more general remarks for all of the papers and for the special issue editors as well. And I think first I'd like to just reflect on what I really think is the value and contribution of of this special issue and its effort to make sense of this cascading series of contestations that take the form of scandals, controversies, and struggles. And on the one hand, questioning, I think, security practices, policies, and people is not new. To date myself, I was thinking about, Iran-Contra. I was 6 years old when that, kind of was the big political scandal of the day. But it definitely does seem to have become more heightened and persistent. So there's the acute context, I think, of the longue durée of the war on terror, the consequences of counterinsurgency warfare, torture, extraordinary rendition. But I think what this collection of essays shows is that you also see these controversies in the realm, as Ludic said, of migration and also of surveillance and data. And that's not just, surveillance and data collection by our traditional security agencies, but as Charlotte's paper really evocatively highlights in the health services as well. So with this kind of diverse set of cases and contexts, the special issue touches on, I think, the kind of longer standing outcome, even the crisis and public response to the broader securitization of more and more realms of public life, which have been normalized and naturalized. So on the one hand, as Claudia and Georgios outlined, the special issue is presenting and providing a set of analytical sensibilities to study and make sense of these contestations, almost a kind of typology, both in terms of the type of controversies we'd see, but also the different mechanisms by which you would trace how and who is involved in developing these controversies. But I think there's actually a more foundational interrogation here of the premises of modern political life. And that's specifically how the promise of security legitimates the modern state as the site of political authority and community. It's at the core of kind of social contract theory, and it's also essential in the kind of bargain that's made between liberty and security in most democratic societies as well. So considered in this light, I really would like to kind of cast the contributions and the special issue as raising broader questions, not only about whether the security apparatus is doing a good job, is it effective, but also equally important is whether security can still be assumed to be an unquestioned public good. And here then you can see a series of ethical questions about whether and how security should be the basis of authorizing various actors, specifically when those actions can be considered exceptional. And then to put this in kind of Claudia and Georgios's terms, you can see the special issue perhaps as tracing and exposing a kind of tectonic shift in public discourse away from raising problems about or within security policies to using their own reference to Foucault, a more fundamental problematization of what can and should even count as security in the first place and for whom. So kind of using that broader context, I guess I have two general questions that I might pose more for kind of collective reflection and also teasers for the broader audience to kind of as an invitation to read the special issue if you haven't already. The first actually has to do about or focus more on this question of the scenes by which controversies take place. And across the contributions, and the controversies they address, I was really curious about the kind of spatiality of contestation and wondered how we might think about kind of a political geography in terms of the politics of contestation, not only in terms of who encounters security and how, but where it takes place. The second question is really about the politics of witnessing and exposure, and the kind of assumption I think that underlies our thinking about scandals, controversies, struggles, is this politics of visibility, right? And it kind of references this ocular-centric approach to knowledge that we even know the secret when it's exposed, right? So how do we think about this kind of politics of exposure, maybe like through the lens of Marshall McLuhan's Medium is the Message, right? How does the actual medium by which the scandal, controversy, or struggle is communicated change the kind of contestation that's more or less possible, right? So if you think about the communication, let's say, of Watergate through newspapers, Iran-Contra, which was quite televised, and now the use of social media. How does that change the politics of contestation? So I'll just leave it there.
Thanks so much, Nisha. Excellent. What we'll do now, I think let's collect the comments and questions by the three discussants and then pass on to the original presenters. Okay. So Christopher, now please.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for wonderful introductions and for this amazing special issue. I've been reading across the different articles and asking myself what we learn about security through these articles that seek to undress security or show how security is undressed through scandals, controversies, struggles, how security is made public in various ways. And this ties on to things that Nisha just raised. So firstly, a main question back to the special issue editors is where does this undressing leave security, or what do we learn about security through these studies? Do we see the naked truth about security, or do we see an emperor without clothes, where security somehow dissolves instead of being solidified or reconstituted in a sense? So that's sort of a meta question for you. I think both the introduction and the articles make a wonderful job at demonstrating these various dynamics of contestation. And you start from in the introduction from the conception of security as an essentially contested concept, and thereby investigating or analyzing security through the notion of contestation really is a genius take on that question of what security really is. But the question is then where it leaves the study of security, because my sense is that by really getting into these various ways in which the contestation is staged through social material staging, as you call it, it also, in a sense, evaporates. It becomes these very concrete practices. It's a bit like what Anna Flamind in her article argues, which is that one should go from thinking of the scandal as solidifying a problem to thinking of a scandal through a sociality of critique, which is embedded in very specific situations where it's really hard to represent the critique and the scandal in more generic terms than what she associates with a test with Boltanski's concept in a very concrete situation of contestation. So in this same sense, I wonder if when security is made public, it is often made public in the name of security. It's undressed as security being demonstrated, but is that also a moment that is productive of security as a form of counter-securitization, not desecuritization, but counter-securitization, where you could call it, or you could think of Charlotte's study of the rehabilitation or the double movement, where security slips back in through the critique of security, the solidification of security through critique or through the contestation. So I think you're very much onto a key aspect of how security is made public, but also how the public makes security through these contestations. So I just wondered if you could address that a bit, Claudia and Georgios, but maybe also Ludek and Charlotte in terms of how this looks from your perspectives. And then Charlotte, I think the study you presented is really demonstrating some mechanisms that are crucial for understanding the role that ethics guidance, but also law and legalization does, politically, how it allows certain practices, and the idea that ethics is, conservative, productive, and wedded to power is not surprising. It's not. It's very well known, but you show these dynamics in a very interesting way, and then I've discussed this as ethics washing or as ethics polishing, as a form of preemptive ethics washing. And I wonder if you see any role for ethical contestation or contestation in the name of ethics after kind of seeing how ethics can then just be co-opted and rehabilitated as a way of reinforcing what has been critiqued. Okay, thank you.
Very good, Christopher. I hope everyone is taking notes. I'll pass on to Maria now.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And thank you everyone for excellent presentations. And as the others have said also, congratulations on this really exciting special issue with so many fantastic contributions. And I also really appreciated your introduction, Claudia and Georgios. So I will start with some sort of takeaways on that to begin with. I really enjoy how you, as we have had discussions in the field of critical security studies about secrecy, about access or hard to access fields, what does that do to our methods of investigating the different terrains that we are interested in? And here you take sort of a step outside to take a look at those processes of researchers, but also investigative journalists, civil society, and other actors asking those questions or using different mechanisms to try and reveal or try to investigate and uncover these processes that are sort of covered with secrecy. So I think this is really a sort of an interesting dynamic that has also been underscored already, but to take another look at how security is made and how it is made public. And I have a couple of reflections and questions on precisely this public part in my different questions here. And this also offers us, I would say, a framework of methodology for all of us to apply, I think, in different respective fields that we are working on. I'll just make a brief observation also on how this also speaks to me, having followed both controversies, struggles around border security in the Mediterranean, but also discussions in the humanitarian field, where, of course, there is also surveillance or monitoring or data collection that is also surrounded with secrecy and opacity in terms of how these mechanisms work. How do the subjects whose the data are collected, are they aware, how does consent function, and so forth, in context of humanitarian crisis that sort of by definition, when they are defined as a humanitarian crisis, become defined as a context of emergency and of exception. So a lot of the same mechanisms are reproduced there. But I also think this is interesting from the perspective of in the humanitarian field, where there's often a say that we need to make the ongoing suffering and ongoing injustice known, that silence kills is something that is often repeated by humanitarian actors in sort of campaigning to make things visible and public. But there is, of course, a question there also on what does visibility do? Of course, I think we can all agree too that visibility is better than invisibility. But there's something about questioning also how is that process of making visible conducted, and for what purposes, and also to critically examine that it does not stop with making public. And I think that your different contributions show that really well, that here it's about what does this process of revealing, what does it do? How does it construct and shape the struggles and controversies themselves to go beyond simply just making visible and perhaps leave it at that. Then I have a question to both the special issue editors and perhaps others. And that is a question a bit relating to both what the role of the public, but also what happens when a controversy or struggle and controversy takes form. And you emphasized the importance precisely of accountability and transparency. And how would you also describe or reflect on some of the inherent tensions in controversies when there might be controversies within the controversy? There might also be scandals within the scandal. That's maybe a separate part. What I mean by that is if in a way the entrepreneurs seeking to put a specific topic on an agenda are being contested themselves as having specific interests and so forth, but also within the controversy. In order to put certain topics on the political agenda, it needs to be clearly framed. What happens then when there are disagreements that are precisely welcomed? The openness of debates and discussion and disagreements is probably inherent in many of these instances here of seeking to reveal and uncover. But how to navigate this tension when there are also important nuances and disagreements and controversies and struggles within the controversy. So I was wondering if some of you might want to reflect on that across some of the different cases. And I also have some specific notes for Ludek's contribution, and thank you for a very good presentation of it here as well. I think it's interesting, or it sort of strikes me again. Of course, this is not something new about the EU, but it strikes me how the EU is sort of in the context of, in particular, border management, but also other contexts. There is this opacity and secrecy at the same time as the EU also plays with being this almost norm entrepreneur with being the standard setting actor internationally in terms of data protection and openness and so forth. So there is this, and of course that's also maybe serves some other parts of its policy making that needs to be, or that is argued that needs to be more protected from public scrutiny. But there's this duality of the openness and the secrecy across different parts of EU policy making. Then my more specific question, and I think it's really interesting how you have used the freedom of information as a tool in itself, but also as a lens to say something about how this particular controversy was shaped and made. And here I'm coming back a little bit to also the role of the public. What do you think? You explained also well how didn't go from being a controversy to becoming more of a scandal. But can you reflect a little bit more on what makes some controversies in this field of border management in particular, what makes some of these controversies stick in the public domain? What makes some of them simply be another investigative report that does amazing and important work, but it doesn't stick more in the public realm as a broader debate? And to which extent is also the broader public debate around migration impacting perhaps on that? And thank you very much again. Looking forward to hearing your further discussions.
Thanks so much, Marie, and the three of you. Really, this I think that this really helps moving the discussion forward. I think this is a very good way to kind of to build on the findings and the ideas that were put on the table by the special issue, and then already trying to advance the debate. So now we have, I would say, maximum 5 minutes to each, and by each, Georgios and Claudia count as one. I'm sorry, because we should end on time. But to react on the questions that you got and the general ideas and arguments that were put on the table. Okay, please go ahead.
Shall I start? Shall we go in the same order? Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all the comments. I'm going to maybe try to answer a couple of the general questions in the interest of time. So just very quickly, I think in kind of taking up the question of how we think about what's changed, right, in relation to the politics of exposure, but maybe I can link that also with the question of scenes. I kept thinking actually about Charlotte's paper, but also questions of kind of surveillance, right, because we always have the entwinement of, what's changed and what hasn't changed, right? So it's, of course, it's different if you, kidnap somebody in the street versus kind of having this kind of very intricate, dispersed, complex data arrangements, right, that are somehow always obfuscating, as well as you had Ludek say. At the same time, we can also trace kinds of surveillance, right, because to grab a person in the street, you also need to have, forms of surveillance. But again, a lot of debate about how that surveillance has changed when it was kind of, listening to somebody's phones and conversations and having this kind of data that doesn't require you to necessarily kind of listen into what they're saying, right? I mean, here it's kind of more directly personal data, but there are other forms of surveillance. So I think it's kind of looking at these transformations that's, to me, it's really important. And maybe the second point that I could make in terms of security and contestation more broadly is like what it means to think indeed analytically rather than just kind of as a statement that security is always contested, right? And we've had, of course, a lot of literature on this and, more theoretical literature, but also literatures that kind of limit, right, contestation, not limit, but kind of think contestations in particular sites, like, for example, struggles among security professionals. So you already kind of think of security as a practice of particular professionals, or you take it out and think it's struggles by those targeted, like it could be migrants, right? It could be those kind of being seen as dangerous, and then you have forms of resistance or a focus on agency. But what does it mean if we actually open up the field to start thinking these contestations through different terms together? What do we learn? And I think we also kind of learn about the mechanism of deactivation or desactivation, if you want, as we heard today. So I think I'll stop here. I would love to say more about a lot of your questions, but I'll turn to Georgios.
Okay, thank you for your questions. I will also try to be as brief as possible. So starting from Nisa and her point about the political geography of scenes of controversy. So political geography, I just want to give you an example. So political geographers typically describe borders as sites that produced through practices. These practices can be practice of control, practice of exclusion, inclusion, and so on and so forth, right? However, another mode of analyzing how a border is made and unmade would be to focus on the actual controversies that revolve around a specific site, a specific space. We try to do this in a paper that we're writing now with a colleague from Trento, Anna Casaglia. And we're trying to analyze, for example, how a specific Italian border is made and unmade through a series of controversies revolving around, for example, traffic controls, logistics, migration, security, counterterrorism, and so on. So the border as a site is not only a place which is produced in practice, it is also a space which is produced through various discourses, disagreements, disputes emerging around different matters of concern and care, let's say. Then to the question of Christopher, which is more of, do we see the real truth of security when we make it visible? I want to answer this through actually the paper of Charlotte, because Charlotte's paper for me was very inspiring. Charlotte introduced me to the work of Timothy Passirat, which is an amazing book. It is one of the books that really changed the way I think about many things. So Passirat, as Charlotte describes, what he says is the following. So by rendering animal killing in the slaughterhouse hidden, by hiding it, right? The consumers do not see the animal, do not see the killing, and therefore mass meat consumption is to some extent normalized and legitimized. In a way, by making killing disappeared, you allow certain forms of mass consumption and therefore contemporary industrial capitalism to evolve, okay? However, one of the critical points in that book is, what happens if we make actually killing visible, right? Perhaps the public will not want to see. Perhaps the public will deny the very the fact that is seeing violence, right? So making security visible does not necessarily expose the real truth of security, because sometimes the public may not want to see what is happening, may want to deny the fact, may do not want to trouble itself, for example, with interrogations of terrorist suspects. Right? It happened in the past. The public may not want to see border violence at sea. So I have written another paper in Security Dialogue about pushbacks of migrants at sea. The paper focused on Greece. The Greek public did not really react to migrant pushbacks and deaths of migrants at sea. So yeah, visibility can be a trap to some extent. Visibility sometimes makes visible certain practices while hiding others also. And then a very brief note on Maria's comment about controversies within controversies or scandals within scandals. Me, I always found very useful the work of Andres Munk and Tommaso Venturini. They have a book, it's called Controversy Mapping. So in that book, they explain, drawing on STS literatures, how we can map controversies by breaking them down into issues, actors, and so on. So issues are the questions at the core of different controversies. So issues are smaller controversies within wider controversies. And by mapping issues and understanding how they interrelate to one another and how they fit to the wider controversy, as well as understanding the different coalitions of factors around specific contentious issues, this I found a very useful methodology to actually make sense of controversies, as well as controversies within controversies. And I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Charlotte.
Okay, I've taken a brief look at my notes, and all of my answers to all of the questions are things that I remain confused by. So we're going to go on a political geography of my own confusion about stuff. So I'm going to do a sort of general reflection on some of the things that Nisha said about the political geography of all this, of controversy, of security, of challenge. And also Maria's points about the role of the public and the appeal to the public, which Georgios touched on. I learned a lot in the last few years trying to scandalize this damn program. And I'm still confused by a lot of what I've learned from it. Firstly, on the role of the public, I'm supposed to be doing a study leave project right now, but I'm not, on public interest tests, because I've become absolutely fascinated by the role of, in all of this controversy and all of the challenges and everything in FOI requests, of the public interest test. And it's almost impossible to find out who does that and what guides them. So I've been interviewing, a few people who do them, and it's this incredibly dispersed political geography of people literally sitting down with a pen and paper, making a decision about which way to go, dispersed across all sectors, private, public, making this decision as to what gets revealed and what doesn't. And it's fascinating to me, and I'm still stuck on it, and I cannot move forward with writing about it. Someone help me, thank you. And also on the political geography of all of this, I was struck by how central investigative journalists remain to what gets revealed and what doesn't. And originally my paper was called Failing to Scandalize, because we totally failed, despite getting 120 odd attendees, most of them journalists, to the first Vulnerability Support Hub's event where we exposed it. It just didn't work. It just didn't catch. It just didn't get taken on. And later on, we found out that you can go to them with revelations, and they'll sort of go and speak to the security actors. And if the security actor has a good convincing answer, the journalist just stops and goes, this isn't interesting anymore, and won't take it forward. So these are hidden sort of structures of controversy and scandalization that block a lot of stuff, as well as actually functioning to sometimes reveal. Yeah, God, I'm depressing. Sorry. Christopher's question. I'm going to be more optimistic here, I promise. So ethics washing, yes. Is there any role for contestation in the name of ethics to sort of get past where we are right now? Actually, maybe. Yes, data protection legislation and public interest tests have just really shut down any ability to stop the system. It's just so legalistic, we can't break it. However, where the CTCCS designed itself so that it has no contact with patients, that doesn't mean there isn't another space where this can be contested. And the space is the NHS Constitution, which is a little known document that is actually much more about a relationship of care and actually it's a result of scandals. It's to make people trust the NHS, that they're going to look after you and here are your rights. It's a Bill of Rights. None of the trusts actually remember that it exists, and it has provisions in there about what happens if they share your information without your consent. They have to tell you that they did it. So this is how I'm now pursuing them. Through executive board level questions, because would you believe it? You may not be able to pose a question to your elected representatives very easily. You can do to an NHS director. Who knew? I found that out recently. So through their own internal ethics, which procedures which were a result of scandals, it might be possible to re-engage them with the fact that this is harmful. To be continued. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Ludwig, now, please.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Charlotte, I'd be very keen to think through collectively the public interest test, because this is something that's been driving me crazy as well at the EU level, where it's even more vague than in the UK context. But to come back to some of the questions, just some brief reflections. Nisha, you mentioned or you raised this question of the politics of exposure and the particular medium that carries the controversy or the contestation. And I suppose, having been quite intimately involved in not just the academic research, but also working with journalists themselves on some of these investigations, it always fascinates me how absolutely critical it is what media outlet you get your investigation in if you want it to resonate in the public sphere. So basically at the EU level, unless you get it in the Spiegel, the Guardian, or Le Monde, it just doesn't get a lot of pickup. So what specific medium carries the investigation determines whether, to a large degree, whether it will be transformed into some sort of political controversy. And then, of course, how it circulates on social media, digital media. Does it get picked up by specific MEPs who issue press releases? Are NGOs already on board to amplify this further? Just yesterday, we published an investigation on Europol running basically an illegal shadow database containing 99% of its personal data for almost a decade. It 24 hours later, it has disappeared. We thought it would be the EU's biggest police scandal. It's certainly not. Possibly because we didn't publish in the right media outlets. And also that relates to Maria's question about, what makes some controversies stick, what makes others disappear. Charlotte talked about how some controversies get blocked before they even, or scandals get blocked before they even become scandals. And I think in the case of Pedra, there was this brief moment, and I thought a lot, and I referred to it in the conclusion, but I don't think I fully, thought it through. But what made Pedra so limited in terms of the political fallout? Well, I think it had something to do with the technical legal complexity. We're talking here about data protection, which anyway is not very sexy. And so there are very few NGOs or members of parliament who have the legal technical knowledge to turn this issue into, to take up the findings, right? Pedra itself is structured by opacity. We know very little about what happens to the data that is shared by Frontex with Europol, to what extent it actually contributes to the criminalization of migrants themselves. So there's this complexity that makes it much more difficult to scandalize or controversify Pedra, as opposed to pushbacks, where I think the moral stakes are much clearer, much more apparent. And perhaps just the last point, I think it's important to situate these controversies, and this was hinted at by Maria, is the broader public debate about migration. And I think even more so, the rise of authoritarianism, of fascist forces in Europe, whereby these controversies can be reappropriated to reinforce existing practices. So if we consider, for instance, the reaction of the far right in the European Parliament to these exposures about violations of data protection, well, for them, this shows that data protection is a nuisance, an obstacle that needs to be removed. So rather than controversies exposing norm violations that then leads to some sort of redress and accountability, no, it actually points out the constraints on state power that need to be removed in the eyes of certain political forces. I'll leave it at this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ludek. Thanks so much, everyone. I think this was really, really interesting. I think this is a format that works well in the sense that starting with a presentation of the general framework, then going to kind of to more specific applications of that framework, those ideas, those arguments, and then having other people already engaging with the themes and advancing the discussion from the get-go. So I'm very pleased about this event. I want to thank all of you, not only your work for the special issue, but also to be here today. I want to thank everyone that is watching this online and that will also watch it afterwards, because this will be made available. And as always, I also want to thank Marit Moprice, that is helping out a lot in the setup of this meeting today. Yes, thanks to everyone, and let's keep the conversation going. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.